Hello, my name is Frances Widdowson, and I was a tenured professor at Mount Royal University from 2008 to 2021 when I was fired in part because of complaints that were made about my views on the residential schools. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is this issue, a particular aspect of this issue, which is the Kamloops Indian Residential School case, which it seems to be becoming more and more likely that this is actually fraud. And so, what I wanted to do is go through the most recent developments in the Kamloops case so we can have a bit of an understanding of the evidence that exists for the kind of misleading information, intentional misleading information, which is being distributed in the efforts to acquire federal transfers because of the false claims about the remains of 215 children being found at that site when there is no evidence for the remains of children being found there. And in fact, it is highly improbable that there are remains there because not one parent has stated that their child went missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So, what I want to do right now is I just want to share my screen to the wokeacademy.info site. So, for people who are not aware of this website, if you go up to the top, www.wokeacademy.info, you will see a site with a number of different materials on it. The most important is the arbitration decision for my case. This decision came down in July 2nd and said that I'd been wrongfully terminated. However, I can't be reinstated because a number of Indigenous scholars feel unsafe about me being there. This is being appealed to the Labor Relations Board, but you can find all the materials there and then more materials on the reasons why I was fired, which, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons is because of my views on the residential schools. And then on the right-hand side, what you'll see is a number of posts, the most recent being the Kamloops clandestine burial fraud. And I am using the word fraud now because I think there is mounting evidence of the intentional effort to mislead to acquire financial gain. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to enter into this post. And what I would like to do is just to go through this post and explain the various elements about the case for the claims about clandestine burials being fraud. So, first of all, before we do that, we have to have a definition of fraud, and this is defined as the intentional perversion of truth in order to induce another to part with something of value. Okay, so we need to have those two elements in order for there to be fraud, intention to pervert truth, and then attempts to get another to part with something of value. I think we'll see that both of those factors are present with respect to the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Now, in terms of the beginning of this story, on May 27th, the Kamloops Indian Band announced the confirmation of the remains of 215 children who were students at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And it is not the case, as is claimed by people like Sean Carlton, that there was discussion of anomalies, there was discussion of potential graves. No, the facts are that on May 27th, it was announced that remains had been found, and what has occurred is that there have been no remains found. It's just 215 anomalies or targets of interest, or 200 anomalies, as we'll see shortly. And so to continuously make the claim that there are the remains of 215 children to try to obtain financial benefits, if you're doing this intentionally, it is fraud. And this seems to be what is occurring with respect to the Kamloops Indian Band. And as you can see from the press release, it is not potential graves, it is not anomalies, it is the confirmation of the remains of 215 children. So stop trying to change history with respect to that situation. We have really come to the point now where we can claim quite confidently that this is fraud. And the reason why we can do this is because of an article that was recently published in Blacklock's Reporter. And if you click on this link, you can actually go into that article and read it for yourself. But what I've done is just extracted some of the most important parts of that article to tease out what the case for fraud. And what has happened in this article is that it is claiming that a First Nation in British Columbia, instead of excavating as it was supposed to, it spent the money on publicists and consultants. And there's been attempts to conceal these documents by the government, and Blacklock's Reporter has been able to get a number of these documents, which we will look at. Just one of them, actually. They've just released one of them. I assume they have more, but they've just released one, which is the most important document. And this was a residential schools missing children community support funding request. This request was made, and as we'll see, it is made in for 2021, 2022, and the amount was $9,255,541. So it's very specific. And more significantly is the project title, which is about the museum and heritage park. That's the site where the Kamloops Indian Residential School used to be. The building is still there, but the school is long since closed. But it says Kamloops Indian Residential School Ancestral Remains Excavation. So in their project title, they have the word excavation. That means that they were making a case for getting money to do this excavation. So we would want to see evidence of them having undertaken that excavation for it to be carrying out what those funds were supposed to be going to. And what you'll notice about this document is there's a lot of redactions. So the activities are redacted, and then we have the eligible expenses and the ineligible expenses. What we would really want to see is what were the eligible expenses that they were claiming to get this approximately $9.3 million, applying for that. And we don't have access to that because it's redacted. Those documents, the redactions, should just be thrown out, and we should get the actual documents so we can see what is actually going on with respect to this case. This is public funds that are being paid. We should be able to know as the public what money was paid to the Kamloops Band for what types of expenses were they claiming. It turns out, according to Blacklock's, that instead of $9.3 million, approximately $9.3 million, it was actually $12.1 million. And that's an interesting question as to where did this come from? Why did it get increased from 9.3 million to 1.2 million? And they note in this article that on May 8th of last year, that's 2024, they were told that the community had received $7.9 million for field work record searches, and to secure the residential school grounds. What does it mean by field work? So field work, one would expect that that would be about excavations. So that is something that would need to be investigated further. That was what it said on that application. But accounts show that it increased to $12.1 million. So how much of that money was supposed to be spent on the excavations and how much was supposed to be spent on the other types of related initiatives? And we do have one case of excavation, which is at Pine Creek, where there were 14 anomalies that were detected on the GPR. They actually went in there and did the excavations, found that there were just rocks there and not remains. So in order to do a similar sized excavation at Kamloops, what would the cost be for that? One would expect it wouldn't be more than $1 million. So the fact that they spent $12.1 million on a whole bunch of other things, but nothing on excavations, is very telling. So in this article, it states that Mandy McCarthy, the acting director general of the Department of Indigenous Crown Relations, tried to get clarification from the Kamloops Indian Band about what they're spending the money on. You'll see here, this is Mandy McCarthy's LinkedIn page, and said that she specializes in diplomatic negotiations, Aboriginal rights, consultations, and so on. And McCarthy asked what archaeological and forensic work was being undertaken and whether the band had all the information that it needed to advance exhumation protocols and DNA testing. So she's wondering what they're spending money on, and she's concerned that they might not have all the information that they need to do this exhumation and DNA testing. But of course, in order to determine whether you need to do that, you first of all need to do the excavation. So that would be the first thing that would be necessary to determine. And this is something that we need to figure out as to, what kinds of conversations were going on about the excavations that would be undertaken at that site. And this is just the part of the Blacklock's article that has McCarthy discussing this area. So what this shows is that there's no confusion here, that it's understood by both parties, the government, the band, that excavations need to be undertaken as part of this funding. It's not like they thought it was going to be for the museum and for the elders' residence, and the government thought it was for excavations. There was conversations going on between the government and the Kamloops Indian Band about what they were supposed to be doing, which was excavations and then, exhumation and DNA testing if that was needed. But we're not there yet. So what I've done is I've tried to compile a list of these expenses that are both accounted for and unaccounted for. So the funding kinds of references, and then what we have is actually confirmed as to what money was spent on. And I put at the first line the $40,000 funding from Canadian Heritage, because that is public money too, that was allocated to the consultant Sarah Beaulieu. I believe she calls herself Beaulieu, although it's spelled Beaulieu. You would expect it to be Beaulieu. That's what she got for her GPR work, which was done on the May long weekend of 2021, which was May 21st to May 24th. We also have that number for basically $9.3 million, about that. And that was the amount requested from Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, which is called CIRNAC, or Indigenous Services Canada. We're not exactly sure what entity the request went to, for the purposes of Kamloops Indian Residential School ancestral remains excavation. We also have the number of $7.9 million. That's what we originally heard was received by the band for field work, records, searches, and to secure the residential school grounds. We learned in the Blacklock's article that an additional $2.3 million was received from the First Nations Health Authority. And if you add up the requested 9.3 million plus the 2.3 million received from the First Nations Health Authority, you're getting close to the 12.1 million. This is about 11.6. So there's kind of still an additional $500,000 that has to be accounted for that we're not exactly sure where that came from or why that amount was received. Anyway, so that is the general things that we have been told about. But then we have the fact that of this $12.1 million that Blacklock is talking about, approximately 11 million is still unaccounted for. And we have the requested amount, which included in that supposedly is payments to 25 consultants. And this was to provide advice and support to the chief and council to develop communication strategies. We don't know who those consultants are. And then expenses included the hiring of architects, engineers, contractors for construction, healing center, museum, funding for an elders lodge. That's all supposedly part of this 9.3 million. And then we have about 1.7 million of the allocation by the First Nations Health Authority that is still unaccounted for. We don't know that what was spent on. And then we have approximately 1.1 million, 1.2 million that's accounted for, 532,000 spent on security, and 641,000 from the First Nations Health Authority funds of total 2.3 million. The other is unaccounted for. 37,000 for marketing and communications, 54,000 for travel, $100,000 for a 6-month pay for 2 trauma counselors, and 450,000 for administrative costs such as speaking fees and tent rentals. So what we need is we need a line by line item for that whole 12.1 million. And we only really have that for 1.1 or 1.2 million. So this is still, we need freedom of information to get those additional amounts. And this is the area in the Blacklock's article where it's talking about those amounts. So that's where I got all those numbers from, was from the Blacklock's amount. And those are all the numbers that Blacklock's provided. Everything else is just kind of hazy. You know, the money for the 25 consultants and the publicists, we don't know exactly how much that was. And we don't know the names of any of those consultants. We do, however, know the name of one consultant, or maybe this is a publicist, classified as a publicist. This is Racelle Kooy. And as you'll notice in Kooy's LinkedIn page, she toots her own horn about the role that she played in, you know, sort of doing communications for the Kamloops Band as a consultant. And she states that she was the communications lead on this file. She assisted the leadership and the community in sharing the monumental and heart-wrenching news to the world. What was the monumental and heart-wrenching news? This was, there's no remains that have been found. So, you know, they shared this news, but that was the remains of 215 children, confirmation, but that was not, turned out not to be confirmed. So Kooy here is admitting that she was part of the kind of network that was spreading this misinformation and perhaps disinformation at that time. So that is amazing that she's boasting about this as to one of her skills as being able to do this. So Kooy, I heard about Kooy on July 15th, 2021, because she was the person, the kind of the public face of the kind of management that was going on. This is a picture that's taken from Sarah Beaulieu's presentation, and you'll notice that Kooy is, kind of managing here. And on the left-hand side, you see Sarah Beaulieu, and on the right-hand side is Roseanne Casimir, who is the chief of the Kamloops Band. So she is managing, and she, at the time, was stating that journalists could not ask questions of the residential school survivors who were giving presentations. So she was very much controlling the information that was happening in this presentation. As well, you can also see Kooy in Tanya Talaga's book, The Knowing. So that's Tanya Talaga's book. And The Knowing is, again, is kind of spreading this idea that this is the cover of the book that, Ken Monkman, where, there's all these RCMP and priests and everything coming and ripping all these children away from their parents. And this is a metaphorical kind of visual. This is not what happened in the residential schools. You did have children who were apprehended, but they were children who were they were orphans, or they were being neglected. If you were just a regular parent, you needed to apply to have your child go to a residential school. So this is, to some extent, you can sort of see by that painting on the is a little bit how Tanya Talaga is portraying the residential schools. Anyway, in chapter 2, she recounts interactions with Kooy, right? And she notes in this part of chapter 2, which I've reproduced for you here, that she was well known in Indigenous media world as a sharpshooter. That's directly from Tanya Talaga's book. And then she was controlling information at this time because of this press release. And we assumed that that press release was just immediately released on May 27, 2021, but we are told by Talaga that this press release actually was developed on May 25th, presumably a day or two after Sarah Beaulieu told people that 215 anomalies had been found, or perhaps that she'd said that 215 remains had been found. And this press release was developed on the 25th and embargoed and sent to select journalists who they felt could bring the devastating news to light with sensitivity. So Kooy is involved at this stage of controlling information, channeling information in a way so as to create this story. Now, to what extent did they know that this was a false story? That is the question. But there was certainly a great deal of control over the information and stopping actual journalists, not activist journalists like Talaga, from, basically spinning the story in a particular way and not asking the hard questions that needed to be asked, such as, how do you know that GPR, has there been any excavations that have been undertaken? Did you know that GPR doesn't mean that there's remains there? It could be other disturbances, soil disturbances. And Tanya Talaga also recounts in chapter 2 that during their first 2 days in Kamloops, our first number of days, Racelle Kooy was interacting with journalists from all around the world and telling them not to come to Kamloops. And Tanya Talaga, in her book, the quote is, "There would be no media at this time, except those select few who, like me, were invited. How could there be?" What does she mean by that? How could there be? Like, obviously, there could be real journalists who would be there asking the questions that would need to be asked. But that did not happen until July 15th, when Sarah Beaulieu gave her presentation. In addition to Talaga being one of the select journalists, who was given the nod, who was, was one of the ones who spin this story in a particular way and not ask, hard questions. Talaga is notable for her connections to Kimberly Murray, who you see on the left-hand side there. And so Kimberly Murray is this person on the left. Roseanne Casimir, the chief of the Kamloops Band, is the second from the left. Here's Talaga. And on the right is Jeanette Jules, who is the manager of what's called The Missing. So The Missing is the museum, is now the name which is associated with the site connected to the museum. But why are people referring to this as The Missing? Because there's no evidence that any child from the Kamloops Indian Residential School is missing. So again, this is misleading information that is getting people to think that the remains of 215 children have been found. And here's, I just got this picture of Talaga and Casimir, because the reason why we're so concerned about Indigenous policy and the circumstances of Indigenous people is because of the terrible conditions that exist in these isolated Indigenous communities, serious problems of violence, low educational levels, terrible drinking water, and probably the worst circumstance, which is the fetal alcohol syndrome. Between 25% and 40% fetal alcohol syndrome rates in these communities. So terrible conditions, impoverishment. Yet we have Talaga and Casimir hobnobbing at the Toronto International Film Festival in their gowns and their fancy attire on the red carpet. This just gives you a sense that we're talking about very privileged Neotribal elites here who are completely integrated in society and don't require the funds that we're spending, this $12.1 million that's being diverted for these kinds of initiatives. So that gives us some sense of the consultants that we're talking about. In the Blacklock's article, what's notable is any absence of any mention of legal services. And as people who know from reading Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, The Deception Behind Indigenous Cultural Preservation, which is the book that I co-authored with Albert Howard, it's both consultants and lawyers being the most significant entity that form the basis of the Aboriginal industry and initiatives like the Kamloops Indian Residential School excavations, the ancestral remains excavations, that initiative, that funding initiative. It's a big Aboriginal industry initiative. So where are the lawyers with respect to this? How much of that 9.3 or $12.1 million went to lawyers in this initiative? And you can see a number of lawyers that are involved in all of this, not just the Kamloops case, but the wider unmarked graves kinds of issue, which it should be pointed out that the unmarked graves, there are unmarked graves. They used to be marked. They're now unmarked because the crosses have blown away and people aren't sure which cemetery or which plot in the cemetery their ancestor is buried in. And a good example of this is Tanya Talaga, who her great-grandmother Annie was in an asylum. Annie was buried in a cemetery that now is no longer is a forgotten cemetery beside the Gardiner Expressway. It's just a grassy area, and she got help with finding out where that was, and she went with her family to go, do a tobacco ceremony on that grassy patch. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a situation like Argentina, where you have disappeared people who were murdered and then buried clandestinely. And that's kind of the constant confusion that is being perpetrated by people like Kimberly Murray, Tanya Talaga, Roseanne Casimir, Jeanette Jules, and so on, is this kind of bait and switch maneuver. So the lawyers, we can see them in the communications with the Simon Fraser Archaeology Department. George Nicholas, who is one of the main archaeologists who's worked with the Kamloops Band. On July 28th, 2021, he told Nina Green that he had been strongly advised by the Kamloops Band legal team not to respond to any queries from the public regarding the search for unmarked graves in Kamloops. And this extends to Dr. Cardosa, so and other members of our department. So that's the first kind of hint we get at the lawyers, besides Kimberly Murray's involvement. Lawyers were also involved in submitting a complaint to the International Criminal Court on June 3rd, 2021. And what they note in this complaint, and you can read through the entire 14 pages of this complaint if you like, is they state in this complaint, the first page, that we have the complaint is regarding the recent discovery of a mass unmarked grave of 215 Indigenous children who were under the forced care of the GOC, Government of Canada, and the Vatican. Right? So in the death of these 215 Indigenous children, mass unmarked grave, on the deceased children. So that's mentioned several times in this complaint. But of course, there's no evidence of deceased children. There's no evidence of a mass unmarked grave, etc. It was anomalies on the GPR. But we can forgive these 22 lawyers because it was before the Sarah Beaulieu presentation on July 15th. They did theirs on June 3rd, 2021. It was only on July 15th, 2021, that Sarah Beaulieu publicly announced that the remains of 215 children had not been found, and it was 200 anomalies that remained as targets of interest, right? And this is the slide that she gave on her July 15th presentation. She said that 200 anomalies remain as targets of interest, and only forensic investigation, excavation, will be able to conclusively determine this. And that raises an interesting question. Why is Sarah Beaulieu referring to 200 anomalies and not 215 anomalies? And this is because that she discovered after the fact that SFU Archaeology Department had done excavations previously in that area where the 15 anomalies were found. And that raises the question, of course, as to why she could not be similarly mistaken for the remaining 215 anomalies. Like, what makes the remaining 200? So what makes the 15 different? She thought those were remains when she did the GPR. Why not the other 200? What? And that's likely that they're also mistakes, like the 15. And this brings us back to the archaeology department, which, as we heard George Nicholas saying, they're under a gag order. His email was on July 28th, so it's one day after this email. Fortunately, Hugo Cardozo didn't get the memo at that time, so he gave some information to Nina Green on July 27th, and he noted in his email that the report was thoroughly investigated, reviewed by a designated review team of 5 archaeologists, very experienced in GPR, and all have agreed that it was methodologically sound. So we seem to have evidence that that's not exactly true, because if it were methodologically sound, Sarah Beaulieu would not have made the mistake of thinking that those 15 anomalies were likely to be unmarked graves, because she would have consulted with the archaeology department, its excavations. She would have been done some research on the excavations. But this is the only evidence that we have that there's actually a report, is this email from Cardozo, because that report has not been released to the public. It was originally promised by the band that they would release it, and then they decided not to release that report. So we don't even know if that report exists. And we should all be able to see that report now, because at the very least, the public paid $40,000. We should be able to see what the methodology was that Sarah Beaulieu used in her report. So that gives you a sense of the legal side constraining the archaeology department, and the 22 lawyers with the International Criminal Court. And then we have Casimir, who cannot really have the same excuse as the 22 lawyers, because they were doing their complaint on June 3rd, which was before Sarah Beaulieu gave her report. Roseanne Casimir, however, in the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, their annual general meeting, which is on September 14th, 15th, and 16th, Casimir moved that on May 27th, the Kamloops Band announced that through efforts to learn the truth about the missing children who attended the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, 215 unmarked mass graves of children were located using ground penetrating radar. So that's that document that you can take a look at. She made this statement on September 14th to 16th, 2021, which was, of course, 2 months after Beaulieu's presentation, which Casimir, as we saw, Casimir was sitting at the table when that presentation was given. And then we have a similar situation the next month, which was on October 18th, 3 months after the presentation by Beaulieu. This is from the Kamloops family heads, the band family heads, the Family Advisory Council. And what they did is they sent a petition to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and they announced in this petition that there was the confirmation of at least 215 unmarked graves of little ones who attended the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This was signed by 13 of the family heads, including Manny Jules, who's a previous chief of the band. Also, Ted Godfredson is a name that comes up over and over again. These are prominent members of the Kamloops Band who knew that there were no remains found. It was anomalies or targets of interest. So why are they making this statement 3 months later to the Prime Minister in an attempt to get more money, to extract more money from the federal government? So again, this is fraud, is that you are, perverting information to acquire, to induce someone to give you a benefit. As we say, fraud is defined as the intentional perversion of truth in order to induce another to part with something of value. All of these things are indicative of this, and the most damning is what Blacklock has released a couple of days ago on at the end of January 2025. They made a funding request for Kamloops Indian Residential School ancestral remains excavation for $9,255,541. They actually received $12.1 million, so about $3 more million than that, largely from the First Nations Health Authority. Yet, the Kamloops Indian Band has not dug even one hole in what was the apple orchard at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This is fraud. Let that sink in. So, what do we need? now to move forward and stop this endless shakedown that's going on. We need three things. One, the release of the Sarah Beaulieu Report. It was funded with a $40,000 grant from Canadian Heritage. We need that report. We need to confirm what the archaeology department said, what Hugo Cardozo said, which was it was reviewed by 5 archaeologists. Who were those archaeologists who reviewed that report? That seems to me to be at best incompetence on their part. We need an impartial investigation and really a public inquiry now to look into this. How did this happen? This absurd thing that happened over the last, it's still going on today. And then we need excavations. You don't need to do the whole site. What you do is you go over to the area where most of the anomalies have been found. This is the area of the septic tiles. And if you look, this is CamRes's website, Graves in the Apple Orchard. What CamRes has done is he has shown all these septic tiles. If you just follow this over, East Sewage Disposal Bed completed in 1925 to 1926, 2,000 linear feet of these tiles. These are in an east-west configuration, which Sarah Beaulieu stated was indicative of Christian burials, which is a ridiculous statement anyway, because these are clandestine burials, supposedly. You would not have people intentionally doing it in an east-west configuration if they're burying people clandestinely. So that didn't make any sense either. But we need to have all of these indications of, I'm just trying to get back here, these three things that we want to see happen to be able to move forward on this file. Wow. This is amazing that this continues to go on. In 2021, I was involved in trying to expose this as early as July 10th. I believe that was the date of our event, which was held with Brian Giesbrecht, Rodney Clifton, and Paul Viminitz. We held that on Zoom. I was still a professor at that time. Can we discuss those unmarked graves? At that time, shortly after that, I was castigated for that event by Sean Carlton and Daniel Heath Justice. I was made fun of by a whole bunch of colleagues, a few colleagues at MRU. I continued to work on this situation and was contacted by Nina Green. That's when I first heard from Nina Green, shortly after that Unmarked Graves presentation. This started up the research group and resulted in me being able to develop the piece Billy Remembers. And I was writing that in September and October 2021 when I was being dragged through my final investigation done by Jeff Hope, which I was found to have engaged in harassment for my 6 satirical tweets, 2 of them which were satirizing the comparison between the Holocaust and the residential schools. Nina's research, I was able to refine that piece after I was fired, and it was submitted to the American Conservative and published. This group has continued to publish numerous articles on this case, resulting in the December 2023 publication of Grave Error, which I have a copy of, and this has 18 chapters in it. You see the table of contents, and a number of different authors. And that now is under attack by people like Kimberly Murray and Leah Gazan, who want to criminalize residential school denialism, which is grave error. Grave error that is the main work that they say is residential school denialism. They want to criminalize that, which is actually criminalizing whistleblowing, because that is what we are doing. We are blowing the whistle on the fraud that the Kamloops Indian Band is perpetuating against the Canadian public. And instead of the government taking responsibility for what it has done and has not been responsible for this $12.1 million that has been distributed, and has not basically got the band to do the excavations that are needed, it is considering criminalizing the actions of the whistleblower. And this is an absolutely shocking sequence of events which has taken place. And so I am calling on the government to hold a public inquiry, release the Beaulieu Report, demand that the excavations be undertaken so that we can figure out for sure what has happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School and stop this endless attempts to extract funds on the basis of false claims that are being made about the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this video to be informative.